Welcome to the new Hegelian Philosophy channel. In this video we will start a new series of videos and a group reading of René Guénon's classic text, The Reign of Quantity. In this first video we will just focus on the introduction, then we will move on to the following parts of the book in the coming weeks. Well, you'll notice that at the start of The Reign of Quantity, Guénon notes in retrospect that in the years since his well-known book, The Crisis of the Modern World, had been published, all of the things it warned about on an abstract level had only been confirmed even more by empirical experience. Current events within the news had provided more than enough confirmation to fulfill the predictions basically outlined within that book, despite the fact that the book wasn't really written for that purpose. Crisis of the Modern World wasn't really written just to provide predictions about mundane current events, things that would go wrong in what was supposed to be the era of progress. Rather, the book was supposed to provide an abstract outline for the reasons why what seems to the naive viewer to be an era of progress is actually an era showing all of the signs of civilizational decline in disguise. Well, Guénon notes at the start of this work that it's necessary to have another one, The Reign of Quantity, because it's not enough just to point out these instances of decline negatively. You also have to provide a positive explanation for why they have come about, and more specifically, why they have appeared at this point in history. Now, on one hand, you could say that they're appearing now because rather than accept a linear view of history in which basically the shape of history is an ascending arrow in which you start with the barbarism and primitivism and ignorance of the Stone Age, and you progress or advance from that caveman state all the way up to space exploration. And we're almost there, Elon Musk tells us. Just a little more investment into SpaceX and we can actually colonize Mars. Well, that's a view of history which is maybe taken for granted today, but is quite different from how things had been viewed in the past. For much of history, the view of history was not a ascending arrow or straight line, but rather a circle, in which the era we are currently living in is not a linear improvement over the barbarism of the past. Rather, this is the furthest you get away from the golden age, which was thousands of years ago, in which everything we consider to be positive was actually viewed negatively. So we pride ourselves on having discovered things like technological automation. But in the world of tradition, in the golden age, thousands of years ago, that was seen for what it really is, which is humans willingly giving up their ability to do anything, including think, by having a non-living machine do it for them. Similarly, we pride ourselves on having a socially progressive society, an advanced civilization in the political criteria of having democracy rather than, say, a theocracy or a monarchy, etc. Despite the fact that in the world of tradition, that sort of democracy was seen as nothing more than a euphemism for the leveling out of all social distinctions whatsoever. What that actually leaves you with, according to Guénon, is a society in which everybody's the same person, but they're all nobody equally. Similarly, we have the tendency to think that real knowledge consists of nothing more than mathematical formalization. In fact, the very standard by which we measure how scientific an explanation is just how mathematically formalized it might be, despite the fact that in the world of tradition, even when people dealt with numbers, they didn't view them as just numbers in the modern sense of the term, as we'll get back to a little later within this video, but they also realized that this mathematical formalization, which serves as the very standard to measure how much a system of knowledge can be trusted in modernity, is actually a euphemism for something else. What this really amounts to is the replacement of other forms of knowledge with a reduction to quantification alone. And that was something which was understood in the world of tradition to be actually inherently negative. If you translate other forms of knowledge into quantification and quantification alone, it really means you have to sacrifice that other content. And that's exactly what has been ongoing for a very long time within the history of especially the West, that has directly contributed to these other forms of decline within the social, political order, etc., and a general decline in people's ability to think. Now, more specifically, Guénon warns that quantification is something that never goes on in a vacuum, because whenever you have it, you are also presupposing its inverse, which is something we might call qualification. So, to put it simply, you can only translate something into a more quantitative form if you remove or lose sight of the qualitative characteristics that would have been visible otherwise. And specifically, the qualitative distinctions, which were visible there in the world of tradition, have largely disappeared in our era through the tendency to get as close to the ideal of total quantification as possible. Now, in the world of tradition, because this was understood to be the case, quality and quantity are inverses of one another, it was certainly understood on a theoretical level that it would be possible to pursue this sort of quantification, but they tended not to do that because they understood quantity to be one of a number of ways of viewing things, but not the most important by far. And we can see this demonstrated in the way that even when they were doing things like mathematics in the ancient world, they weren't really treating the subject matter of mathematics as numbers in the modern sense of the term. For the ancient Pythagoreans, for example, numbers weren't really numbers as we consider them, so much as they were like gods. When they were dealing with quantities, in other words, they still were able to see qualitative distinctions that have become invisible in the time since then. And this is why the Pythagoreans were not just a group of mathematicians, they were also like a religion, okay? And their tendency to think of numbers as things which can be understood rationally precisely because they exist beyond the physical world as basically godlike things is what you also find in Platonism translated into the theory of the world of ideas. In the world of ideas, you find that you are able to understand things intellectually within this life because you actually saw the things that the things in this life are copies of, which are the ideas in the world of forms, but those are not simply abstract constructs of human thinking. They really exist within the Pythagorean view, basically like gods. And this is a way of viewing the world which would seem totally impossible, unthinkable today, only because we have replaced qualitative distinction with quantitative distinction as far as we can possibly take it. But this is something which appears from the standpoint of the world of tradition, from the standpoint of the Pythagoreans, to be merely a degraded or truncated version of those past fields of knowledge. It's like viewing the same thing, but in a much smaller form, with a lot of the really important context simply chopped out unnecessarily. And this is the sort of a tendency that you can also find displayed in the way that ancient geometry wasn't just a study of spatial figures as totally empty constructs of human thinking. Rather, geometry in the ancient world was sacred. There was literally a sacred geometry, which you see, say, in the symbols of the Hermetic magic, in which these symbols were meant to actually open up a pathway to higher levels of being, because the tendency to think that spatial figures are just mathematical constructs in the modern sense of the term really was unknown at that time, because that also presupposes that all you can have is an approximation of some knowledge you were trying to get at. But in contrast, in the sacred geometry, the symbols of the Hermetic magic, etc., it's not just an approximation. You were actually gaining access to the knowledge in and of itself to lead you to another higher level of being beyond what in the Hermetic tradition would be called Malkuth, or the kingdom of merely physical things. And for this reason, Guénon notes that insofar as our mathematical knowledge is just a truncated version of this older, fuller knowledge, even within the realm of math, he says that people in modernity are exactly like the people in Plato's cave. They see a shadow of the real thing, which has a certain resemblance to it, but with most of its content subtracted out. That's what our quantification really amounts to. Now, Guénon notes that it is proper to call this sort of decline Western because, in a certain sense, it started in the West and it has spread into the East through the sort of Westernization that you see with, China transitioning overnight from an imperial traditionalist civilization, much like it had been for thousands of years, overnight into a technologically industrialized communist atheist civilization simply through being infected by the theories of the Western thinker Karl Marx. But Guénon warns that although the East became this way through Westernization, it's wrong to think of East and West in literally geographical terms, not only because there's less and less of the traditionalist East left within the world with each passing year, but also because the terms East and West have a more symbolic than literal value in this context. The reason why we say that decline is Western is because that's where the sun ends up when it finishes its daily cycle. If the sun is setting, where does it go except to the west? And that's where you find the thing talked about in Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West instantiated. For in German, what does that title actually amount to except the drowning of the evening lands in the sea when the sun has set? As the title of that book in German is Der Untergang des Abendlandes. So this will finish our meditation on the introduction. We will move on to the first chapter of this book next week. Thank you for listening.